Hey guys, Mr. Wilhelm here. Today I'm here to talk about ecological succession. Now, ecological succession is about a biological and environmental community, plants and animals, a forest, that comes about after some sort of event. Um, it could be a forest fire and how a forest and grasses and plants and animals come back after a forest fire. It could be a new community, such as a forest or a grassland growing where there was not a grassland or forest before. So let's break this down and look at succession a little bit more closely. Succession is a series of changes in a community in which a new population of organisms gradually replaces an existing population. Okay? So we've got new plants and new animals that come in and they grow and develop in place of an old population, an old set of plants and animals that have died off for some reason. Now, there are two types of succession. The first type is what we call primary succession. Primary means first, okay? So here I've got a community that's going to grow in an area where there was no community before, okay? So primary succession. There was no community before. Okay, so primary succession, no community before. Now, in this case, we're going to have new organisms that are going to come into an area. Usually this area is just bare rock. That's all it is. There's no trees, no grasses, no soil even. It's an area of just bare rock, and we have organisms that come in and they start to colonize. If you take your if you take your knowledge to your history classes and so forth, you know that when a new colony is formed, a new colony of people, that's when we have people come in and they start to establish towns and communities where there were no towns or communities before. It's the same thing when we're talking about the environment and ecology. Colonization is where you have new organisms that come in and start to grow where there were no organisms before. So here I've got a picture of some lichens and some mosses growing on bare rock. Okay, there were no other organisms there before. It was just rock. So primary succession might come from some place like a lava bed, okay, around a volcano. So we've got this volcano. The volcano is erupting with lava. The lava cools and forms rock. So I've got this large area. There is nothing but rock. There's no soil. There are no other plants. There are no other animals. And I've got bare rock. And after a time, seeds will start to be deposited by birds and by the wind. And those seeds will make their way down into the cracks of that rock. And these plants, being very well adapted for their situation, start to grow. They find little nutrients that have been also deposited in the cracks of those rocks and can thrive and live off of those nutrients. And again, those plants start to grow on bare rock, essentially. Okay, so there was no community before. Primary succession. Primary means it's the first time it's occurring. So we have these plants and they start to grow. As the plants start to grow, like this one in the picture here, and this is a picture of a little plant growing in this wrinkled up bed of hardened lava that is now rock. As the plants start to grow, the roots start to work their way into the rock, and the roots start to break the rock into smaller and smaller pieces, okay, into sediment. And over time, that sediment starts to turn into soil. So the plants start to colonize and start to break down the rock and turn that rock into soil. Over enough time, the plants will eventually take that rock and turn it into more and more soil. More plants will come in and start to grow upon that soil, and eventually we'll have a forest. That may take a couple of years. In this case, usually thousands of years. Another example where we might find bare rock and primary succession taking place is where we have a glacier that has been uh, that has melted and has retreated and has exposed new rock. In this picture, I've got a boat down here on the water, and I've got this giant mound of ice that's going up this valley. Okay, that is a glacier. Glaciers are sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of feet thick. And over time, the glaciers start to melt. And when the glaciers do melt, they expose this rock. And underneath this glacier and this newly exposed rock, there are no organisms. Nothing has lived there before. So this would be another opportunity for plants and seeds to be deposited, start to grow, start to break down the bare rock, turn it into soil, okay, and then start to establish a community, a biological community. So again, primary succession. Primary meaning that there was no community there before. There were no plants or animals there before. Now, organisms that are the first into a primary succession community are called pioneer organisms. And again, going back to history, it makes sense. Okay, people that explored new land, people that were the first into new areas, are called pioneers. Okay, same thing. Pioneer organisms. It's an organism that goes into an area where there has been no organisms before. In this example, we have this little green substance called a lichen. A lichen is a very well adapted plant that is able to grow on essentially bare rock. And it also starts to break down that rock and turn it into soil. And that lichen itself, when it dies, becomes nutrients for future plants as well. So pioneer organisms, those are organisms that are the first to come into an area. They're the first to colonize. They're the first to colonize and come into an area, into a pioneer, a primary succession situation. So here's a diagram of what we might see over time in a primary succession. So over here, we have our pioneer community. Okay, we have our pioneer species and our pioneer community. It is composed of lichens and other mosses, okay, small little plants that are able to grow on that bare rock. And they start to break down that rock into smaller sediments and into soils. And as they die and decompose themselves, they become nutrients for future plants to grow upon. Again, over time, we start to get larger grasses and shrubs and trees, as we see in the pictures here, um, that replace the lichens and the mosses. And again, as they die and decompose, they themselves even create more and add more to the soil foundation. Then that makes the way for even larger trees. Okay, even larger trees. And then finally, we get to the end here, which is what we call a climax community. It's the end point. So the pioneer community is the beginning point. It's the first organisms in, and then over time we get to the end point, which is the climax community. That means that the environment, the community, the ecosystem at this point is fully established. It's as far and as most established as it's going to get. Okay, so a little bit more on climax communities. Climax communities are stable, mature communities. At this point, there is no succession that's taking place. This is as mature and as established as the community is going to get. An example here might be the deciduous forest in Virginia, a very, very old, well-established forest. Okay. Okay, so the second type of succession is called secondary succession. And obviously, secondary means second. Okay, so secondary succession. Now, secondary succession is going to occur where there was a community before. Okay, so there was a community before in secondary succession. Now, this is usually going to occur after some sort of natural catastrophe, some sort of natural disaster that takes place. Could come from humans. This would happen after a forest fire, or maybe after a tsunami, or something along those lines, where the land is cleared out, all the plants and animals are destroyed or moved out. Okay, we've had all the forest fires earlier this year down in the Kingdom Possum Lake area, um, burned thousands and thousands of acres of land. Okay, destroyed all the trees that were there, and there are no plants or animals there anymore. But over time, but over time, plants are going to start to grow. Okay, seeds are going to be carried in by the wind and other animals. Plants are going to be able to start to grow, and then they're going to start to reestablish a second community in the place of that original community. So here's a picture of a forest fire. Again, the land being cleared out. Okay, there was a community there before, but that community is destroyed. And then again, over time, you start to have new organisms that grow in the place where the old organisms used to be. Okay, so here I've got a picture of a little plant. You can see that it's starting to grow among these burned pieces of wood, okay, in this burned forest fire area. And it's going to start to grow and replace what was there before. Now, also, secondary succession can also occur as more simpler situations such as farming. In the farming situation, um, crops grow, the crops are harvested, and once the crops are harvested, like the corn is taken up and harvested, the farmer goes back and he plows under what's left, and it goes back to being an empty field. And then the next season comes along, the farmer plants more crops, and it grows a new series of plants. Okay, so this is kind of more of a man-made type secondary succession. There was a community, there were plants there before. They are then destroyed by men, by humans in this case. Okay, and then a new set of plants come in to take place of the old plants. So here's a diagram of secondary succession. Okay, now it looks very, very similar to the first diagram of secondary succession. Um, Here we start off with small plants, okay, flowers, grasses. Now, these are not necessarily pioneer organisms because they're not the first organisms to be there. Being secondary succession, there were organisms there before, but they're the first organisms into this particular area. So we got small grasses and shrubs that start to grow. You see over time, the shrubs get bigger and then start to develop into trees, and eventually you get to larger trees. We still get to this climax community situation, okay? It's the most developed biological community that we have. Now, something to note here, and this will be a question on your quiz, is that a secondary succession happens much, much quicker than primary succession. So if I asked you on a quiz which type of succession is going to occur faster, you would say secondary. The reason secondary succession happens faster is because there is already a soil base there. Okay. In primary succession, it's just bare rock. Rock is hard, rock is solid. It's hard for things to start to grow and establish themselves. And it takes thousands of years for that rock to be broken down and turned into soil. But in secondary succession, there was already a soil base that existed. The plants and animals were removed, but the soil remained. Okay. And therefore is much easier for new plants to come in to start to grow. Primary succession might take thousands and thousands of years. Secondary succession can happen over 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Okay, it happens much, much quicker. So that's something you need to be aware of, and that's a question you'll see on your quiz is which type of succession happens faster, and that would be secondary succession. Okay, guys, I appreciate you paying attention and listening and following along through this PowerPoint, and we will see you next time.